Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. It is very nice to be up here. Oh, that feels very loud. Am I loud? Yeah, it's great to be here. It's great to be bringing us a message today. And I think I'm encouraged before I even start, because I feel the message that we're going to be concentrating on today is quite timely, actually. And you never know these things when you are planning in when you're going to speak and when you're going to be available to bring a message. You don't really think about the bigger picture and the rhythm of church, the rhythm of the seasons and the rhythm of life. And I feel like the message that we're going to be thinking about today is quite timely for our church in this moment. Because for those of you who have listened to me and been hearing the messages I've been bringing over the past couple of months, you'll know that I have been looking at our vision statements, haven't I? I've been using our vision for this church as a theme for me to be thinking about, for us to be focusing on each time that I have spoken. And we have started with rebuilding broken lives, and we moved on to revealing truth. And today we are thinking about reaching out in love. And I feel like when we are at a place in our church calendar when we are restarting ministries that have had a pause, when we are looking to the season ahead in the coming months, and we're going to have opportunities to gather as a church and to engage our community, turn our focus outward a little, to invite people in to share with the things that we're doing and to share our love of Jesus with them. These are all opportunities that we are going to get, that we have on a weekly basis, to be reaching out in love. So it feels quite a timely message for me to be thinking about today. And unsurprisingly, for those who have heard me speak on those other subjects, you will be aware that I've been using the book of Nehemiah, haven't I, to inform our learning and our understanding about these other statements. And today is no different. We are going to be looking again at the book of Nehemiah. We're going to be looking at the beginning of Nehemiah's story. And for those who haven't kind of been able to keep up, I'll just give you a recap of where we are up to. Because Nehemiah is part of the whole narrative of the Israelites, isn't he, and God's people. And he appears in the narrative at a time when the people have been living in God's promised land and they have not been obeying him well. And they were captured and they were taken to another part of the world, and they'd been living for a time in exile, away from their promised land, hadn't they? And we are at a point in the story, Nehemiah kind of breaks in at a point when people were being able to go back to their homeland, to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah had news about the state that Jerusalem was in, how it had been destroyed when everybody got captured. And the walls were broken down, and the gates had been burned, and the city wasn't a safe place for God's people to gather. And when we looked originally about rebuilding broken lives, we had learned about Nehemiah's reaction and how he was really saddened to hear this news, and he was heartbroken. And so where we are jumping back into the story today is 4 months after that original news that Nehemiah had had. And Nehemiah is still living his life. He is still fulfilling his duties. He's a cupbearer to the king. But he is still feeling anguished, and he is quite heavy of heart. And so I'm going to just read a couple of verses of the next part of this narrative. And this is Nehemiah He is writing this, so it reads like a bit like a diary. And he is at a point where he is in his role serving the king. And so it says, I took the wine to the king and I gave it to him. So this is Nehemiah writing. And since I'd never been sad in his presence, the king asked me, why do you seem sad? Since you aren't sick, you must have a broken heart. And Nehemiah replied, may the king live forever. Why shouldn't I seem sad when the city, the place of my family's graves, is in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king asked, what is it that you need, Nehemiah? And Nehemiah says, I prayed to the God of heaven. And I replied, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, please send me to Judah, to the city of my family's graves, so that I may rebuild it. And then he says, the king gave me what I asked for. The gracious power of God was with me. So we're going to leave it there in that very little short narrative. Now, I am sure we have all heard the expression, oh my goodness, that's written all over your face. I'm sure that we have heard people or been engaged with people who have been able to understand how we feel. Could be good or bad. It was lovely to see Pippa's expression up here this morning, wasn't it? We could all tell from her big smile that joy and happiness and gratitude was written all over her face as she received her book. But we all have situations where sometimes the way that we are feeling can't help but be expressed on our faces. Maybe as we've arrived here this morning, we have experienced that as we've greeted one another. Maybe we're looking, going, ooh, I can tell your weekend's been, what, full of cake, ladies? Yes. Full of interesting conversations, gentlemen, maybe. But we can usually tell, can't we? And I think our poor Nehemiah today in our narrative, well, this phrase certainly applies to him, doesn't it? We can see that Nehemiah was so troubled by the needs of his people that he couldn't help but express his sadness. It was literally written all over his face. It was noticed by the king. Nehemiah was carrying the burden of his people's suffering. The people that he knew were on God's heart. And this is something that we learned when we first encountered Nehemiah and we were talking about him rebuilding broken lives. We understood that Nehemiah knew God's heart. And because he knew God's heart, he knew what was breaking God's heart. And Nehemiah felt the weight of God's broken heart for his people. And he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't hide it. And as he tried to continue on in his role, living his life and doing his job as best that he could, he was weighed down and he was saddened. He was saddened by the injustice, by the suffering, by the brokenness that he'd been made aware of. And it was a sadness that was expressed in every look on his face. I think this is where Nehemiah can teach us something about being people reaching out in love. Because I think reaching out in love begins with us feeling burdened by the needs of those around us, the needs of the people that we are reaching out in love to. Now, I am not saying that we need to walk around permanently looking sad and heavy-hearted. But perhaps we need to be burdened enough to consider what we could do about the brokenness that we see around us. Because that's what Nehemiah did. That's what we learn Nehemiah did. When he heard about the state of the walls of Jerusalem and the life that his people were living, he could have quite easily said, "Oh, that's a real shame. Let's hope there's some competent builder nearby who will be found and who will go and sort that problem out and help those people." He could have hoped that there was somebody who lived a little bit nearer, who had the right resources available, perhaps, to go and to help them. Because, after all, Nehemiah wasn't a builder. He was a cupbearer to the king. And he didn't have the resources to think about rebuilding a city. But what he did have was a heart that was burdened by the needs of God's people. And that was enough for him to begin the process of reaching out and of recognizing that he could do something about the things that grieved him. And so we ask ourselves a question. As people who know and love God, like we realize Nehemiah did, as people who are part of a church that have decided we want to be reaching out in love, I wonder what grieves us. I wonder what things we care so deeply about that it shows on our faces and it motivates us to respond. It's an important question. And the answer to these questions, well, they may not lead us to go and rebuild a city in some faraway land. But do they at least lead us to step outside of our door? I've got something for us to consider. I don't know how many of us have been aware over the past couple of weeks. We have a homeless person who is sleeping outside of our church at the moment. He's been there for a couple of weeks. And if you've been entering the church through the doors into the annex, you may have seen a bag of bedding. You may have seen it rolled out, depending on what time of day you come. Because it's rolled out usually in the morning when they've left. And then it's put back again of a night for when they want to return. And we don't know this person. We don't know anything about their circumstances. But we know that they are a person in need, that something in their life is broken. And they've chosen to come and to find safety in the reach of our church. I wonder how that makes us feel. I think if we're being brutally honest, these things, they challenge us, don't they? What our response is. And as we think about being people reaching out in love, is this the situation that we had in mind? I wonder what our response would have been had they have been there this morning as we had arrived in church. Because this isn't a situation that's happening in some faraway land with people that we don't know. This is literally happening right on our doorstep, right now, with someone who is on God's heart. And it's likely that this situation is one that few of us have any experience of. Probably makes us all feel a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps unsafe even. But just like Nehemiah, we have to decide how we're going to respond. Will we be the people who carry the weight of this man's brokenness? Or are we going to be the people who ignore the issue because, after all, what do we know about being homeless? Is this what reaching out in love looks like? And if it is, are we moved enough to take action and to do something to help? There's lots of questions this morning for us, isn't there? Let me tell you a story while you're thinking about them. I'm sure most of us will have heard this story before because it's an illustration that is used a lot. But it's one that helps us to understand the situation. And it's a story about a little boy, and he's walking along the beach. And on this beach, there are thousands of starfish that have been washed ashore. And they are all over the beach as far as the eye can see. And this little boy is moving along, and he's picking up a starfish and throwing it back in the sea. And he takes another step, and he picks it up, and he throws it back in the sea. And he's just engaged doing that. And there's people passing by, and they're ridiculing him, and they're laughing at him, and they're saying, what's the point of doing that? You're not going to help them all. What difference are you making? There's thousands. And the little boy reaches down and he picks up another starfish and throws it into the sea. And he says, well, I've made a difference to that one. Being people reaching out in love means that we take action in response to the need that we see around us. And Nehemiah teaches us this too, even in these short little verses, because he didn't just see the need, he acted on it. When the king asked him, well, what do you want? Nehemiah did two things. The first thing he did was pray. And we've seen him do this before, haven't we? This was his response when he first heard about the troubles that the Israelites were having, and when he first heard about the state of Jerusalem. When we were looking at our first statement there, rebuilding broken lives, and we realized and understood that that was the first response that Nehemiah had. He prayed to God about what he had heard, the brokenness that he could see. And here in our passage that I've read, he is still praying 4 months later for the same thing. But after he prayed, the second thing that Nehemiah did was that he put God's plan into action. And Nehemiah made sure that he was aligning his heart with God's heart. And then he took action. He trusted in God's way of doing things. And he had a choice to make. Was he going to remain in his place of comfort and safety with everything that he knew? Or was he going to trust God and follow God's ideas of what it means to reach out in love? For those of us who were here last week, Paul was reminding us of how God does things. If we remember, we were looking at Jesus telling the story of the Good Shepherd, weren't we? And we learned that in that story that the Good Shepherd, he left the 99 sheep to go and tend to the one sheep that was lost. The Good Shepherd would leave the 99 that were on the inside, Paul told us, and he would go to the one that was on the outside. And Paul left us with a question. He asked us, are we following Jesus' example to go after the outsiders? Might make you feel a bit uncomfortable again. But as we think about our homeless friend on our doorstep, do we need to ask ourselves that question again? Are we following Jesus' example and going after the outsiders? So, as we think about the opportunities that we have over the coming months that we have mentioned, that we have witnessed the start of yesterday, in our ladies' brunch, in our men's breakfast, these are events that we invite people to. We've mentioned the Macmillan Coffee Morning coming up. We've mentioned Open House starting up, Chapel Tots starting back up. As we think about all of these things, and we are proclaiming that we are a church that is intent on reaching out in love to our community, we must remember that everything that we do has to be done in response to our personal knowledge of the Good Shepherd. This is the example that Nehemiah sets us. So let us remember also how God has already reached out in love to us. And he's done that by sending Jesus. Jesus carried the burden of our brokenness, and he took action. He laid down his life so that we can experience the love of God reaching out to each and every one of us. And so if Jesus has shown us that kind of love, how can we not do the same for others? Even just the one. We're going to sing a song now. We're going to play a song. And I don't know whether it's known to all of us, but it's a song that reminds us of how God reached out, of how he still reaches out with his love, with his overwhelming love, with his never-ending love, and some may even call it reckless. So we're going to play a song, and it's called Reckless Love. If you know it and you want to sing along, please do. If you don't, maybe just think about the words and think about our message today of reaching out in love. I don't know what we were expecting to hear when we think about reaching out in love, but I hope we have heard something that's challenged us and that will move us into action in the way that God wants us to. Let's sing Reckless Love together.